Goes on, oh, I see, okay.
Good afternoon. The Subcommittee on Regulatory Reform, Commercial and Antitrust Law will come to order. Without objection, the Chair will be authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome everybody to the hearing today on triple threat to workers and households, impacts of federal regulations and jobs, wages and startups, and I will now recognize myself for an opening statement, having made an opening statement simply by reading the title. Some people in Washington, it seems naturally or even desirable for the world to be governed by an endless expanding web of intricate rules. Perhaps that's because Washington is a city of zealous policy advocates and lawyers, of which I am not one. A 2012 Washington Post article noted that law firms are flocking to Washington, D.C. to work centered around the Capitol's regulatory regime. There's no question that's true. I'm sure when I ask each of you your professions, I'll get 2 out of 4 as lawyers as a start. But I think more obviously, this is a city of lawyers. This is a city and a region in which you can't even get off jury duty by being a lawyer because they couldn't get a jury impaneled if they let lawyers off the hook. There is a great distance, both physically and socially, between the regulators and the regulated. Regulators understand job impacts intellectually. They understand what they hope to achieve in the way of protection, but they often do not meet with industry representatives, but they are within the D.C. bubble. No one they know is going to lose a job because of overregulation. Increasingly, there are 2 different worlds. Perhaps the insensitivity explains the current administration's fanatic commitment to increase regulations even as the recovery remains shaky. Each year since 2008, regulators have added more than $100 billion, that's billion with a B, in new regulatory cost. For 2016, the administration plans 22 economically significant regulations, up 20% from 2015. Outside the Beltway, we feel the impact. The National Black Chamber of Commerce study found that EPA's proposed Clean Power Plan would impose severe and disproportionate economic burdens on poor families, especially minorities. No wonder Gallup recently found a near record 69% of Americans name big government as the biggest threat to our country's future. Regulatory advocates, of course, dismiss this. Instead, they focus on the aggregate employment. Factory workers may lose their jobs, but people in Washington assume they can find other ways to make a living, perhaps go back to law school. And that just shows how much out of touch regulatory advocates often are working here in the public world of Washington, D.C. Any count of the aggregate number of jobs also ignores the quality of those jobs. Data shows that job displacement causes significant and lingering economic and physical hardship. Regulatory compliance jobs do not boost productivity, or another way of putting it is, you never got a faster horse by putting more people on its back. Moreover, as formal OEIRA, Administrator Cass Sunstein has argued, even if you are not convinced that regulations kill jobs, regulators need to be giving a lot more attention to that risk. Unfortunately, only 20% of agencies qualify employment effects. Meanwhile, unemployment and underemployment are far higher than they are reported at any time, and particularly as of January, we certainly see the U6 unemployment rate, which includes those workers who cannot find full-time work, stands at 9.9%. Similarly, the labor force participation rate remains at near all-time lows. Many displaced workers have simply given up looking. Job creation depends on startups and new businesses. New businesses account for nearly all net new job creation and almost 20% of gross job creation. Yet, the U.S. has dropped from 20th among developed economies in terms of business startup activity, has dropped to 20th. Economists identify regulatory hurdles as one of the most significant influences on business dynamics. Today, almost 40% of U.S. jobs require a government license as compared with 5% just one generation ago. It is worth examining root causes of this trend and when federal and state regulatory requirements serve as barriers to market entry. In 2008, business deaths outnumbered business births for the first time in 35 years. Overregulation has wrecked the old economy. Now it is suffocating startups. We have a unique panel of witnesses from old line businesses as well as startup community who can help us understand how deeply this problem is affecting our constituents, and I truly look forward to their testimony. And with that, I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Johnson of Georgia, for his opening statement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing, the so-called triple threat of federal regulation on jobs, wages, and innovation, is yet another attempt to justify the crony capitalist mission of regulatory reform, to suggest that we don't need any regulations and that regulations are terrible and that's what harms, that's a threat to jobs, wages, and innovation is just ridiculous. While my Republican colleagues have repeatedly asserted that regulations inhibit job growth, all of the available evidence demonstrates that regulations play little role in unemployment. As the unemployment rate shrinks month by month, this argument has now shifted to wages and innovation. Notwithstanding the slippery nature of the regulatory reform debate, the facts remain clear. There is little to no connection between federal regulation and jobs, wages, or innovation. Leading experts at the University of Pennsylvania conducted an exhaustive study in 2014 that found that, quote, the evidence demonstrates that regulation plays a relatively small role in determining the aggregate number of jobs, end quote. Earlier studies by a host of experts in economics and administrative law reached similar conclusions. The Economic Policy Institute, San Francisco Federal Reserve, and the National Employment Law Project have also refuted the assertion that regulations undermine wage growth. And finally, the economics chair at the Mercatus Institute, which is a bastion for conservative free market economic theory, has debunked the argument that regulations undermine innovation, finding that the exact opposite is true. Quote, industries with greater regulatory stringency have higher startup rates, end quote, as well as similarly high job creation rates. Meanwhile, the latest report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that unemployment has fallen to 4.9%, the lowest since the George W. Bush recession. That's over 70 straight months of private sector job growth. I think that's about 14 million jobs created over the last 70 months. And that is with the Obama regulatory system, which, by the way, is very pro-worker, pro-environment, pro-public health and safety, and pro-innovation. Even conservative economic theorists have given up insisting that pro-regulatory policies undermine our economic output. As Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum, and with great gnashing of his teeth, as he noted himself, quote, with low unemployment and rising wages, the Republicans' job gets a lot harder, end quote, while noting that a recent jobs report was, quote, promising, end quote. Finally, some will argue today that the sharing economy is proof of the positive effects of deregulation. I strongly oppose that sentiment. The sharing economy involves nuanced questions concerning the interplay between competition, regulation, and consumer protection. It has opened new markets to competition that didn't exist just a few years ago, while raising novel and complex regulatory issues. But let me be clear, the innovation economy has flourished under the Obama administration, just as the internet blossomed under the Clinton administration. It does not exist in a regulatory or legal vacuum, and there is zero trade-off between innovation and consumer protection. In fact, as studies have repeatedly found, consumers only use services where there is a strong foundation of trust. As the chairman of the subcommittee knows, I have called for a hearing on this subject, the innovation economy, which this subcommittee exercises ample jurisdiction over. Indeed, we could have an entire series on it, but sadly, today's hearing, the 29th anti-regulatory hearing of its kind, will not explore the issues raised by the sharing economy in a thoughtful and even-handed way. But I look forward to action on this issue, and with that, I will yield back.
Thank you. It's now my privilege to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers.
Chairman Issa, we haven't conducted a hearing on the devastating impact that overwhelming student loan debt has on families and on our nation's economy, or how to strengthen protections for employees and retirees of companies and municipalities that seek bankruptcy relief, or the life-threatening public health and safety ramifications of penny-wise, but in my view, dollar-foolish budget cuts made by unelected emergency financial managers, as illustrated by the catastrophic Flint water crisis and hazardous condition of Detroit public school buildings in Michigan. And these are matters that affect millions of hardworking Americans and that have no real consequences, not the illusionary so-called triple threat referred to in the title of today's hearings. And I say, I use the term illusionary because there is no empirical evidence that regulations have a deleterious impact on job growth. In fact, one could argue that a strong regulatory environment actually promotes job growth. For example, my colleagues here on the other side assert that the current administration has issued an unprecedented number of regulations. Assuming that is true for the sake of argument, how can they ignore these facts? 3 of them. Unemployment has fallen by half since the 2008 Great Recession. The United States is in the midst of this is number 2, the United States is in the midst of one of the longest running streaks of private sector job creation in history. And 14 million new jobs have been created over the past 7 years. And what about the impact of regulation on wages? The economic report of the president, which was just issued earlier this week, reports that wages grew faster last year than at any time since the Great Recession. Admittedly, wages have not increased as much as they should. They've remained flat, but that's cause is not because of over-regulation. Rather, wage stagnation is largely a symptom of workplace inequality fostered by declining union membership and the resultant diminished bargaining power of lower and middle wage workers. Now, 60 years ago, 1 out of every 4 workers belonged to a union. Now, Today, less than 10% of Americans belong to a union. In fact, union membership in some states is less than 3%. Declining unionization, according to one study, accounts for between a fifth and a third of the increase in inequality since the 1970s. And finally, with regard to the illusionary threat that regulations inhibit the creation of new businesses, this too is inaccurate. Startup companies, by bringing new products and services to the marketplace, are vital to productivity growth in the United States, and startup creates jobs. In 2013, startups created more than 2 million new jobs compared with established firms that accounted for over 8 million new jobs. Unfortunately, there are real barriers to entry for new companies. Weak antitrust enforcement over the years has substantially reduced competition, thereby allowing larger firms to squeeze new entrants. In addition, existing firms often lobby for rules protecting them from new entrants. Eliminating these real barriers to entry should be our committee's priority, not spending yet another hearing dealing with illusionary problems. And in closing, I want to thank the witnesses for their presence and participation. I look forward to the hearing of their testimony, and I thank the chairman for his indulgence.
I want to thank the ranking member for his well-thought comments, and would note that at this time I ask unanimous consent that the chairman of the full committee's statement be placed in the record without objection, so ordered. Additionally, I would ask all members' opening statements be made a part of the record without objection, so ordered. I would now ask, before we begin, for all the witnesses to please rise and take the oath. Please raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you will give here today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please be seated. Let the record indicate that all our many witnesses answered in the affirmative. Today we're pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses. From left to right, we have Mr. Paul Murray. He's Vice President of Operations at the Murray Energy Corporation. Murray Energy Corporation is the largest independent coal company in America. He has worked at surface and underground coal mines his entire career. His duties have spanned positions from laborer to vice president. Mr. Murray earned his bachelor's degree in mining engineering at West Virginia University and his master's in business administration from the great state of Ohio, Ohio State University. Go Buckeyes. Ms. Janet Caberth is president of Whitcare Gear Company. It is a fourth generation, congratulations, you beat all the odds, family-run company that has been manufacturing clay products since 1916 in northeastern Ohio. It currently operates a plant in Alliance, Ohio that employs 80 people. During her over 30 years with the company, Ms. Caberth has held roles in information systems, marketing, accounting, and strategic planning. Additionally, Ms. Caberth serves on various industry and community boards. She earned her degree in education at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, the alma mater of our speaker, Paul Ryan, and a master's in business administration from Baldwin-Wallace College. And I'll take just a moment to say, as a native Clevelander, you've spent your whole life within a short drive of where I grew up. Our next witness, Jared Meyer, is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. His area of expertise includes microeconomic theory and economic effects of government regulations. His work has been featured in various national publication and media outlets. He is also the co-author of a book, Disinherited: How Washington is Betraying America's Young. Mr. Meyer earned his bachelor's degree in finance with a minor in philosophy of law at St. John's University, where he graduated summa cum laude. Next, we have Dr. Patrick McLaughlin, Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center, previously mentioned as apparently not a bastion of liberalism. His research has focused on regulations and the regulatory process. Prior to joining Mercatus, Dr. McLaughlin served as a senior economist at the Federal Railroad Administration. He has published in the fields of law and economics, public choice, environmental economics, and international trade, and has testified before both the House of Representatives and the Senate, as well as state legislators. Dr. McLaughlin earned his bachelor's degree in language and international trade, as well as his master's and PhD in economics from Clemson University. Dr. Robert Weissman, is it Weissman or Weissman? Weissman, is the president of Public Citizen. His expertise ranges from corporate accountability and government transparency to trade and globalization to economic and regulatory policy. Prior to joining Public Citizen, Mr. Weissman served as director of the Corporate Accountability Organization at Essential Action and as editor of the Multinational Monitor. He is widely published and has made many media appearances. Mr. Weissman earned his bachelor's degree in social studies from Harvard University and his JD, again from Harvard, where he graduated magna cum laude. No slouch is he. Dr. Bevins, you are last but not least. Your research and policy, you are the Research and Policy Director at the Economic Policy Institute, often called EPI. Your expertise includes microeconomics and monetary policy and economics of globalization, social insurance, and public investment. Additionally, you have provided expert testimony on issues before the U.S. Congress, as well as analysis for the United Nations and the Trade Union Advisory Committee. Dr. Bevins is widely published, including both books and articles, and has made various media appearances. Before joining EPI, Dr. Bevins was assistant professor of economics at Roosevelt University and provided consulting services to Oxfam America. Dr. Bevins earned his bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Maryland at College Park and his PhD in economics from the New School of Social Research. Again, I said it was a distinguished panel. It certainly is, and I thank you. And with that, I would only, as you might imagine, say with this large panel, would you please strictly stay to 5 minutes or less. The counter, a little traffic light there, will guide you. Green, of course, means you may continue as quickly as possible. Yellow means you really have to go quick. And, of course, red always means stop now. With that, our first witness, Mr. Murray.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you. My name is Ryan Murray. I'm Vice President of Operations at Murray Energy Corporation, our nation's largest underground coal mining company. I'm here today to discuss the devastating impacts from the stream protection rule proposed by the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement. The nation's mining operations, our proud American coal miners and their families, our numerous suppliers, and our communities. While I will focus today on the stream protection rule, it is just one of many regulations from this administration that are destroying our industry's jobs, operations, suppliers, communities, and families. Murray Energy and subsidiary companies have over 2,000 employees out of work right now from our peak employment of 8,000 employees in May of 2015. Several hundred of these men and women I hired myself. Due to the destructive and illegal actions of the Obama administration, our industry is under attack. Now, with the proposed stream protection rule, our industry will be eliminated for no environmental benefit. The SPR was originally conceived to keep surface mining operations from mining through streams. However, during the 6 years it took OSM to draft the SPR, the rule was manipulated into a complete rewrite of the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act of 1977. This is most likely due to the fact that OSM drafted the rule largely behind closed doors and without meaningful input from primacy state agencies, nearly all of whom dropped out of the formal consultation process with OSM because they deemed it to be a sham. Now the SPR will ultimately end all underground longwall mining in the United States. Longwall mining is the safest, most modern, cost-effective, productive, and environmentally friendly method of mining in existence. As the diagrams attached to my testimony show, due to OSM's incredibly broad and unsupported interpretations in the SPR, extremely vast portions of Murray Energy's coal reserves and those of other coal companies will be sterilized if the rule is finalized as proposed. Incredibly, OSM has not even considered the need for a grandfathering provision, which means that primacy states will be required to overturn existing permits for which significant time, planning, and resources have already been expended. Simply stated, the SPR eliminates the United States coal industry. For underground mining operations, the SPR is expected to strand 289 million tons of coal reserves annually, with a value of at least $18 billion per year. Additional impacts include a decrease in recovery of coal reserves by up to 64%, loss of annual contribution to the nation's GDP of between $26 and $58 billion, and $3 to $6 billion in federal and state tax revenue reductions. This will be devastating for America. This is a human issue. Layoffs are expected to be dramatic, with between 40,000 and 77,000 coal miners expected to lose their jobs. These estimates completely undercut OSM's ridiculous suggestion that there will be minimal job impacts from the rule because coal mining jobs will be replaced with compliance and government inspector positions. The broader effects of these layoffs will be enormous as suppliers, retailers, and others feel the impact of reduced spending from the mining industry. One outside expert concluded that the SPR would cost between 112,000 to 280,000 jobs throughout the United States. Another analysis indicates an even greater ripple effect where one lost mining job causes a loss of 11 additional jobs in the community, meaning up to 850,000 lost jobs as a result of the SPR. For a coal miner, losing a job, even temporarily, is financially devastating. Most often, their major asset owned by many miners is their home. When they have to relocate just to attempt to find work, to whom are they supposed to sell this home? Their community is devastated. The administration asserts that these coal miners will simply be retrained for other work within their communities. The reality is there are virtually no other high-paying jobs in these communities. The average wages of a U.S. coal miner are typically double those of the average in their community. Additionally, suppliers to the coal industry will be further devastated by the SPR. For example, one major equipment supplier in the mining industry, who is a world leader in innovation and development, had their first layoff in the company's 80-year history just last month. The SPR will push this innovation and manufacturing to other countries permanently. Lastly, the impacts on coal mining communities themselves will be significant. Many of these communities rely on coal severance tax revenues to fund critical programs and projects, including school districts. OSM wholly ignored all of these real-world consequences, which disproportionately affect low-income households. The Obama administration's regulatory assault can best be described as a political power grab of America's power grid. It is my sincere hope that Congress will stop the proposed SPR rule. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on behalf of our nation's coal miners, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Ms. Caboose.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is Janet Whitaker-Cavath. I'm the president, CEO, and chairman of the board of Whitaker Greer Company, which has manufactured clay products in northeastern Ohio since 1916. As we celebrate 100 years in business, we are very proud of our heritage. We operate a manufacturing facility in Alliance, Ohio that employs approximately 80 people. We manufacture fire brick for the inside of masonry fireplaces and paving brick. In Washington, D.C., paving brick made by Whitaker Greer formed the sidewalks along Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House. I'm here on behalf of my company and the brick industry as a whole as I serve on the board of the Brick Industry Association. We are a very small company within the brick industry. We only have one plant that has 2 kilns. Our industry and our company is committed to doing our share and to doing the right thing for our employees, our vendors, customers, and communities. However, as our industry continues to struggle to come out of the Great Recession, we, like many others, have limited resources. It's extremely important that these limited resources be used judiciously and on the most important issues. It's critical that every dollar we spend gives back some benefit. There are many regulations that affect us, but I'm going to talk about two regulations today: the Air Toxic Standard, or BRIC Act, developed by the U.S. EPA, and the proposed revisions to the silica permissible exposure limit, expected to be issued very soon by OSHA. These two rules and their crippling impact on the brick industry illustrate how workers in local communities can be devastated by new regulations. The current BRIC Act is the second time in a decade that the EPA imposed major requirements on our industry. The agency finalized a rule in 2003. Our industry complied with the rule in 2006, but in 2007, the courts vacated the rule. Our industry was in compliance with that rule when it was thrown out and had spent over $100 million to install 80 of the 100 controls that now exist in our industry. The EPA used the performance of the new controls to establish even lower limits for its current rule, which it finalized in late 2015. For many brick companies, this will require them to tear out the existing controls that they spent millions on and purchase more costly new controls in order to produce a slight benefit to the environment. While the BRIC Act does allow a health-based standard for some emission types, full compliance will probably require the installation of control devices for particulate matter and mercury for most kills. For our plant in Alliance, Ohio, the estimated cost is $4 million for control devices in operation. This represents 23% of our current net worth, which would eliminate at most 4 pounds of mercury per year. In September 2014, OSHA proposed revisions to the current PEL for silica. This reduction was proposed as a one-size-fits-all type regulation that is typical. OSHA estimates costs for this rule to average $38,000 per year, annualized over a 10-year period for a brick plant. However, compliance would require an initial capital expenditure of about $906,000. OSHA has been provided a significant set of studies conducted over the last 75 or more years, demonstrating that the response to the silica used in the brick industry is very different from other industries, and they acknowledge the much lower incidence rate of silicosis from our industry. They also separately acknowledge the high costs of their rule. However, they do not put these two pieces of data together and consider our industry separately when attempting to show that the rule is justified. In both these cases, the statutes that direct EPA and OSHA to develop these rules have flexibilities contained with them to allow these agencies to meet their obligation without destroying our industry. We just don't know how to make them use these flexibilities and to take the time to do it right rather than just doing it quickly, and to not take a one-size-fits-all approach that will destroy an industry. Compliance with both of these rules at the same time will devastate our already threatened industry, where 75% of the companies are small businesses. This is well documented in a report issued earlier this month by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce entitled "Regulatory Indifference Hurts Vulnerable Communities." Practically speaking, from my end, compliance with both these regulations would require me to obtain a loan for $5 million that would add equipment that would not reduce our costs, improve our product, increase our sales, or provide any health benefits for our employers or neighbors. It would be impossible for us to obtain a loan of this size that wouldn't provide us with any benefits. I spent the last 2 years trying to obtain financing for a kiln renovation, which would reduce our natural gas cost by approximately $500,000 per year, but it took me 2 years to find a financial institution willing to lend us the money. The cost of compliance with both these regulations at the same time would put us out of business, and we're not the only ones. If the inability to comply would cause us to go out of business, more than $8 million would be lost from our local community. We pay over $4 million in wages to 80 families. Many of our employees would have difficulty finding other employment due to their low level of education. However, if these regulations would save lives of our workers or neighbors, they would be worth it. But for both of these rules, the agencies themselves have data that show that the benefits of these regulations is minimal or non-existent for our industry. So I guess I would like to think that after 100 years of providing good employment, paying taxes, and trying to be a responsible corporate entity, that someone in the government could look at the cumulative effect of this regulation and help us. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Meyer.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Johnson, and other members of the House Judiciary Committee, Thanks for giving me the opportunity to give testimony on how the current model of federal regulation stands in the way of millennial entrepreneurs. Millennials have been called the startup generation, but few young Americans have followed through on their entrepreneurial dreams. About 2/3 of millennials want to work for themselves at some point. Yet, less than 4% of private businesses are at least partially owned by someone under the age of 30, the lowest annual proportion on record. Government policy, particularly in regards to regulation, ignores the reality of a 21st century economy and continues to hold back millennials' economic opportunity. Congress has granted executive and independent agencies freedom to regulate with minimal oversight, and these agencies consistently understate the cost that their pronouncements place on young Americans. It is impossible to know the full cost of America's 175,000-page Code of Federal Regulations because executive agencies refuse to take count. For example, during 2014, only 16 of the over 3,500 rules published in the Federal Register had a cost analysis. This lack of oversight occurred even though there were 290 significant rules and 69 economically significant rules that year. These types of rules generally have over $100 million in annual negative effects on the economy and are supposed to undergo rigorous review. Agencies are also increasingly acting as legislators. In 2015, there were over 50 regulations for each law that Congress passed. This imbalance shows the need for Congress to take back its authority from agencies. Public review and transparency requirements do not apply to agency guidance documents, memorandum, or notices. These growing types of shadow, or also called dark matter regulation, lack transparency, even though they can impose substantial costs on young Americans. This negative effect can be seen in the Department of Labor's efforts to make it more difficult for independent contractors to work. The Labor Department recently issued an administrator's interpretation, which did not have to go before the public for comments, that downplays a lack of control over workers' hours as a determinant in employment status. The flexibility that independent contractor status offers workers is vital for many industries, including the emerging sharing economy. The sharing economy's embrace of technology, convenience, and flexibility embodies many young Americans' economic ideal. While some workers use these platforms full-time, the vast majority use them for part-time work or supplemental income. For about the 70% of young adults who experience an average change of over 30% in their monthly incomes, the opportunity to smooth out earnings to meet rent, pay down student loans, or fund a new business venture is a benefit of the sharing economy that must be protected. Young Americans realize how out of touch regulators are with today's economy. If you look at it, only 18% of millennials believe that regulators primarily have the public's interest in mind. The worker classification needs to be sorted out by Congress, not courts or unaccountable executive agencies. The alternative is the crippling of economic opportunity by executive agencies who are set on incorrectly classifying the vast majority of new economy workers as employees. The House Judiciary Committee deserves credit for establishing a task force on executive overreach, as there are many ways that Congress can regain control over federal agencies and restore a lost economic opportunity for millennials. Part of the reason for the ineffectiveness of previous reforms is the inherent incentives that agencies have to expand their reach. Internal regulatory reviews have not led to meaningful reform, but how could they have? The hands-off approach that Congress has given agencies provides little incentive for self-control. The three main priorities for meaningful regulatory reform should be slowing the continued growth in the cost and number of regulations, repealing outdated and burdensome regulations, and giving the public a greater say in agencies' actions. Many promising regulatory reforms have already been introduced in the House. The Regulatory Predictability for Business Growth Act, the Regulatory Accountability Act, REINS Act, Red Tape Act, and Scrub Act all address at least one of these important priorities. Young Americans need a stronger voice in the regulatory process, and their elected representatives can provide that check. Millennials value transparency, democracy, and accountability. It is long past time for Congress to apply these principles to U.S. regulation. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you. Dr. McLaughlin.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me. My main point today is simple. Regulations contribute to poverty. That may sound counterintuitive, perhaps because some people assume that the costs of regulations are limited to compliance costs and that those costs are paid primarily by businesses. This belief is incorrect. There are at least two specific ways that the costs of regulation can actually be regressive, meaning that the costs are disproportionately borne by low-income households. First, regulations have regressive effects by increasing the prices of basic necessities, such as electricity and housing, which typically are the big-ticket items on the budget of low-income households. Second, some types of regulations are associated with higher levels of income inequality because they make it too costly and too difficult for entrepreneurs from the lowest segments of the income distribution to start their own businesses. On my first point, in contrast to the belief that businesses pay the cost of regulation, regulatory growth is in fact associated with increases in the prices of all goods for all consumers. A recent study, which I've submitted for the record, found that a 10% increase in the quantity of federal regulations is associated with a 0.7% increase in prices. While 0.7% may sound small, consider that this same study found that regulations grew by 33.6% from 2000 to 2012. A simple linear calculation of the effect over time implies that 2.31% of price inflation was associated with federal regulatory growth. However, if you consider annual compounding, which would be appropriate given that this is a rate of growth, the total price inflation associated with regulation over that period is close to 9%. I promise I won't mention annual compounding again. That percentage is the average across all households, but the price inflation associated with regulation is worse for low-income households because the big-ticket items in their budgets also happen to be heavily regulated. For example, electricity costs make up more than twice as much of the budgets of low-income households compared to high-income households. Because it's heavily regulated, the regulatory price inflation associated with the good is also relatively high. My second point is that regulations can contribute to income inequality. In a study that I submitted for the record, a co-author and I examined a sample of 175 countries to learn more about the relationship between regulation and income inequality. We found that those countries with more stringent entry regulations tend to experience significantly higher levels of income inequality. The explanation for this is straightforward. When entrepreneurs cannot legally open a business because of the cost or difficulty of dealing with regulations, they may abandon the idea altogether. Consider the long-standing reputation of America as the land of opportunity, where you can lift yourself up by your bootstraps with enough hard work. Indeed, entrepreneurship has historically been one of the best paths from rags to riches. If regulations are inhibiting this process, people with low incomes have fewer opportunities to rise up the income distribution. In sum, there is mounting empirical evidence that regulations are contributing to poverty. First, they have regressive effects caused by increasing prices, particularly for those items that low-income households purchase most. Second, regulations can contribute to income inequality by increasing the cost of starting a business. This makes it more difficult for entrepreneurs to start their climb up the income ladder. Although these facts are surely disheartening, there is good news. Because regulations disproportionately harm low-income households, regulatory reform offers an opportunity to enact a policy that would effectively act like a tax refund, because it would reduce the price inflation associated with regulations. However, unlike a one-time tax refund, the benefits from regulatory reform would repeat year after year. They would not increase the deficit, and they would be progressive in their nature. That is, they would accrue foremost to low-income households. The regulatory process in the United States leads to regulatory accumulation, the buildup of rules over time. Federal regulatory code currently contains over 1 million individual regulatory restrictions. If you actually tried to read regulations as a full-time job, it would take you over 3 years to read the entire code. Over 3 years. The accumulation of regulation is both undesirable because of the unintended consequences associated with it and avoidable. If this accumulation of regulation is harming not only the economy, but especially low-income households, it is certainly time to consider ways that we can eliminate regulations that are obsolete, duplicative, ineffective, or otherwise undesirable. We can and should change the regulatory process to reduce the ways that federal regulations are hurting not helping low-income households. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Mr. Weissman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Johnson, members of the committee. This hearing is constructed around looking at the costs of regulation, but it does not make sense to think only about the costs without looking at the benefits, without thinking about how it nets out for society. You mentioned in your opening statement that it's important to take into account the impact of regulation on real live people, and that's true, but we have to think about that for regulatory benefits as well. When we fail to protect the safety of our food, real people get sick and die. When we make our air clean, lives are saved. Real live people's lives are saved. When we improve safety and health in our workplaces, it makes a difference for real, actual people. These are not hypothetical matters. They make a big difference, and the history of regulation in America is that it has conferred enormous benefits on our country. It has actually conferred not just health, safety, and environmental benefits, but significant economic benefits. Now, I think there is a substantial literature of non-empirical and poorly constructed studies that suggest the contrary. But when you actually look at the regulations that are adopted, in fact, look at the costs, look at the benefits, as OIRA does on an annual basis, the benefits exceed costs by between 2 to 1 or 15 to 1. As an aside, the study that Mr. McLaughlin was just referring to relies on data from the World Bank. The long time lead to establish a new business in the United States, 4 days in that study. Hard to see how that is a significant contributor to economic inequality. Regulation, additionally, is not responsible in any scaled-up way for job loss. Before the Bureau of Labor Statistics stopped collecting data, very few employers reported that regulation was responsible for layoffs as compared to general business demand. And if we pause for a moment and think about our recent history and what is by far the greatest contributor to job loss, not just in the last 10 years, but in the last 70 years, it was the Great Recession, due in substantial part, by almost any account, to regulatory failure, either too few regulations, too much deregulation, too little regulatory enforcement. So in fact, it is regulation, and it is lack of regulation and lack of regulatory enforcement that has been by far the greatest contributor to job loss, as well as, of course, disruption to families, households, and wages. Moreover, there are substantial savings available, economic savings that come from smart regulation. I list a number of examples in my testimony. Energy efficiency rules have saved consumers hundreds of billions of dollars. The introduction of generic competition for pharmaceuticals has saved more than $1.5 trillion as compared to brand name prices over the last decade. The administration's Clean Power Plan would save between $260 and $840 billion in net costs and would actually reduce overall energy bills for households if it were to take place, if it is to be ultimately implemented. A final point. As has been noted, this committee and in Washington has been engaged in a debate about regulatory policy for quite some time and revisited many similar arguments, I think, over time. And it might be useful to move beyond the same back and forth debate to have a more empirically informed debate, but also to think about where there can be a meeting of minds. And as regards the issue of startups and small business, it seems to me that there is a great opportunity to think about how regulation can promote competition and benefit small businesses. For example, there is substantial evidence of manipulation in the energy markets which directly impact the ability of small business to operate effectively. That would be an excellent area, in my view, for further committee investigation and for congressional action. There's a substantial problem of patent trolls and the abuse of patent monopolies to undermine innovation in the IT sector. There are problems from too big to fail and too big to jail financial institutions not providing adequate credit to small businesses. That is an appropriate area for investigation and action by this committee and by Congress. Mr. Johnson has introduced legislation to address the problem of forced arbitration, which denies even small businesses the ability to bring antitrust claims against large corporations that are engaged in unfair and monopolistic practices against them. That, too, I think, is an area where there should be action, where we can see where regulation will actually empower small business, increase market competition, and make our country stronger, safer, and more financially well off.
Thank you. And certainly you got to rise positively when you talked about patent trolls. Thank you. Yeah, there you go. Dr. Bivens.
Thank you.
Something for everyone. Doctor.
And thank the members of the committee, and particularly the chair and the ranking member, for the invitation to testify today. I'm the Research and Policy Director at the Economic Policy Institute, and I'm also a macroeconomist by training, which means I have a pretty decent grasp on what the best research indicates are the drivers of overall trends in job creation and wage growth. This research is clear that regulatory changes at the federal level are not primary drivers of these trends. And this finding applies both to the long historical record as well as to recent economic history. For example, during the recovery from the Great Recession, a recovery that officially began in mid-2009. Over the course of this recovery, there's really little evidence that a surge in excess regulation has held back either job growth or wage growth. Perhaps the clearest evidence of this can simply be seen by looking at the profitability performance of the U.S. business sector since the recovery began. A case that some regulatory surge since 2009 has strangled businesses' ability to expand really should rest on evidence that regulations are making production less profitable. But production has not become less profitable for American business since 2009. Both pre- and post-tax profit margins have essentially matched 50-year highs during the latest recovery. And so there's very little evidence that lack of profitability or anything about regulations imposing excess costs on businesses could really be holding back employment growth in today's U.S. economy. And people have noted that employment growth has not really been held back. We've had 71 straight months of private sector job growth. The one really clear weakness in job growth during the current recovery is the public sector. Federal, state, and local governments have actually shed jobs, about 2.5%, over the course of the recovery, in very stark contrast to any other post-war recovery. In the recoveries in the early 1980s and early 2000s, public sector jobs grew by about 11% and 5% respectively, so it's really hard to see any fingerprints of excess regulation stunting job growth over the past 7 years. You know, this is not to suggest that no rule ever can't be disruptive to any community. If the argument is that regulations with net benefits should be accompanied by measures to ensure that no specific set of communities bear a disproportionate burden of the gross costs, that's a very worthy conversation to have. That's unfortunately not the conversation we generally have about regulation. Turning to wage growth, it's clear there's a genuine problem in the American economy. The bottom 70% of the wage distribution has seen essentially stagnant growth in hourly pay over about the last 3 decades. That includes the period in the late 1990s where wages were actually pretty good when labor markets got very tight. But the problem of stagnant wage growth certainly did not begin in 2009. Hourly wages for the bottom 70% were stagnant over the economic recovery that preceded the Great Recession. And hourly pay for the typical worker has actually steadily fallen behind growth in economy-wide productivity since the late 1970s. And this wedge between economy-wide productivity growth and hourly pay for the typical worker has been driven in large part by regulatory retreat, not regulatory overreach. The clearest example is the fallout from the Great Recession is the clearest cause of stagnant wage growth recently. This recession was caused, as Rob mentioned, largely by the failure of regulators to check excess in the financial sector. Besides the regulatory failure that contributed to the Great Recession, the stagnation of hourly pay has been driven by intentional policy decisions, lots of regulatory decisions, that took away traditional leverage mechanisms for low and moderate wage workers. The value of the federal minimum wage was allowed to erode for excessively long periods of time without Congress raising it. The playing field wasn't kept level between willing workers who wanted to form a union and employers who were trying to block such efforts. Federal protections guaranteeing the right to overtime pay were allowed to really stagnate as the salary threshold was not updated for inflation. Lack of enforcement in wages and hours has made wage theft rampant for low-wage workers. I'd say American workers really do have real wage problems, but they don't have much to do with any alleged excessive regulations passed in recent years. And I would echo the call that the regulatory debate in turn should hinge on the pros and cons of specific regulations and not rely on sweeping claims about some bundled, homogeneous mass of regulatory changes that are allegedly driving economy-wide trends in job and wage growth. With that, thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. I'll recognize myself for some questions. And, Doctor, since your microphone is still close, pull it in. Dr. Bivens. My father-in-law was a World War II Army Air Corps pilot. He was a bomber pilot out of England flying over Germany. And I'm sure that when the 4th Air Force and all these others were rating what happened on a given day, if they sent out 100 planes and 99 came back, it was a good day. And if they sent out 100 planes and 80 came back, it was a bad day. But whether you were one of one or among the 20, for you, it was a really bad day regardless. So when you gave the macroeconomics view, you really weren't addressing what is happening to an 80-person employer in Alliance, Ohio, who after 100 years is being faced with essentially having to buy her company anew almost to comply with the regulation. For her, she's being shot down, isn't she? Or a coal company that effectively is losing all of its resources through retroactive regulation. So for those two, there is an economic impact, isn't there?
Yep, there definitely is. There's also jobs created by regulatory changes as well.
They're usually here in Washington, that's true.
And for places that do energy efficiency to meet the same regulations that are affecting energy.
Again, those are the people on the horse. It's one of those amazing things is here in Washington, they always think that more people on a horse makes the horse go faster rather than more horses make it go faster. And this is also a place where, as you know, there's more horses' asses than horses. But it is absolutely amazing to me that everybody thinks a good job is a job sitting on the back of a horse telling the horse to go faster, not actually getting more horses to actually pull the load. Ms. Cabot, I'm going to focus on you in my short time since we're fellow Ohioans. And although I went to Kent State, so it's a little different curriculum.
I won't tell you what we say about Kent people.
If you can't go to college, go to Kent.
There you go. Yeah, you already know.
No, we know that, and we even say worse things about some of our athletic teams. However, let's go through 100 years of your family's history. I assume you were making bricks 100 years ago, including some of them on Pennsylvania Avenue, as you said in your testimony. Materials you used substantially the same 100 years ago?
Yes, basically it's clay and shale, raw materials from the ground. We used to use coal to burn them. Now we use natural gas.
Okay, so 100 years ago, you used coal. You burned it naturally the way they do in Hanoi today, so black smoke. It was pretty awful, no question at all.
Right.
And as you switch from coal to maybe cleaning up coal a little bit, and then ultimately to natural gas, either way, your particular count went down much cleaner, right?
Yes.
Okay, and that transition occurred over many, many years, right?
Yes.
And so you made a decision to convert your kilns or to buy new ones at the end of a cycle when you decided to reinvest, right?
Correct.
So the speed of new regulation at that time was one in which you were looking at changes in a way in which your company could meet those requirements and plan for them, right?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned that recently you upgraded some of your equipment and you made a large capital investment, and that capital investment was somewhat based on existing regulations you were complying with, and now you're being asked to comply with regulations when, in fact, that equipment is still relatively new. Is that your testimony?
Yes, that's correct.
So, in your case, if I understand correctly, for the 4 pounds of mercury a year that your plant would put out, and correct me if I'm wrong, that 4 pounds of mercury at a given production level is about the same 4 pounds it was 100 years ago, right?
Yes.
So we're not talking about a new pollutant. We're talking about something that was in place in the 1960s and 70s when these laws were put in place.
Yes.
So after 40 or 50 years of the government having the ability to regulate, and after they regulated and caused you to make capital investments just a few years ago, they're now asking you to make another major capital investment, essentially bet your company on new equipment to deal with something that's been around for 100 years and certainly for the 50 years, 40-some years of the Clean Air Act. Is that right?
That's correct.
So your testimony today, if I understand it, and I just want to stick to your testimony because I've lived that life as a manufacturer, is there's nothing wrong with your wanting to invest in new equipment and reduce this. It's the fact that they want you to do it on their schedule, which is immediate, rather than on a reasonable schedule of compliance that gives you time to plan for and make those capital investments in the ordinary course of how people improve their business. Is that right?
Yes.
Last question, the age of your equipment. What is, you said you had relatively new kilns. How old are they?
We have a kiln that was built in 1955. Our second kiln, we've been renovating, and it was built in 1960.
And I'm going to close with this. You mentioned that it took you years to get the loan so you could begin getting a new efficiency level that would save, I believe, $500,000 a year.
Yes.
And on a $4 million payroll, that's a lot of money.
Yes.
So if the government really cared about the balance between your reducing CO2 emissions by taking $500,000 worth of burning of natural gas out versus this 4 pounds of mercury, they would actually be helping you get a low-cost Lindra loan so that you could reduce that consumption, wouldn't they?
That would be really nice.
Sometimes we just miss Ohioans when we're looking for energy savings. Thank you, and I now recognize the ranking member for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the members of the panel for coming here today to testify. Mr. Murray, it's your contention that regulations are what is resulting in your industry not doing as well as it had in the past?
Yes, sir.
Which rules in particular, in addition to the stream protection rule, are you unhappy with?
In addition to the stream protection rule, we have the clean water rule, the mine dust rule, the ozone rule, and the clean power plan that we're currently dealing with, along with a myriad of other regulations that have been pushed under this administration.
Now, you're aware of the fact that 95% of the world's scientists, as I understand it, all agree that the burning of fossil fuels like coal produce heat-trapping gases that are the main cause of the ongoing rise in global atmospheric temperatures.
I'm not a climate scientist. I'm a coal miner. But I will say that by the EPA's own admission, you could shut down every coal-fired power plant in the United States, and it would have a negligible effect on the climate. That's a fact. They've stated as such. I'm here today to talk about the stream protection rule. This is a real issue. It is a job killer. It's going to affect those on fixed income, low-income families, senior citizens, and it is a catastrophic rule that will destroy underground coal mining in this country.
Well, you know, there are a lot of organizations that take a different view of the stream protection rule, and they see a need for regulations to protect clean water, to enable us as people to enjoy clean water. And, you know, regulations have their place, do they not?
Yes, absolutely. We're for clean water. There's laws on the books right now with the Surface Mining and Control and Reclamation Act of 1977. Those rules are complied with daily. We have more environmental scientists on staff than we have mining engineers. So we work with the state and federal agencies continually and apply our good science and good faith and sincere concern for the environment on a daily basis, and we work with those agencies. And the rules that are on the books now, they work, and they don't need to be materially rewrote under the stream protection rule.
Well, I can appreciate your view on that, and others have a different view. And, you know, fact is the coal industry is subject to a lot of pressure from I mean, Ms. Cabot, her industry or her company has moved away from coal-fired plants or coal-fired production to natural gas. Is that right, Ms. Cabot?
Yes, that's correct.
And so natural gas is one of your competitors, Mr. Murray. Is that not correct?
Absolutely, yes, that's correct.
And that's another factor that's causing your industry to not be doing as well as it once did.
That's correct, yes.
Mm-hmm. And you believe that, both of you believe, do you not, that health of workers is a legitimate area for regulation?
Absolutely.
Yes.
So you're not contesting any occupational safety rules, occupational health and safety rules, are you?
In the mining sector, we have one called the mine dust rule, which on its face sounds like it's a health and safety rule that would help our miners, but in fact it does not. But that's as far as occupational safety health measures, that's the only thing we would be contesting.
And Mr. Bivens, your conclusion is that these regulations have no impact on job creation or investment or profits or even wages for workers. Is that correct?
Not at the economy-wide level. There's definitely some shuffling of jobs. You do have some negative impacts in some sectors of the economy that are counterbalanced by positive impacts elsewhere. But aggregate trends, no. Regulatory changes are just not a primary driver.
All right, Mr. Weissman, you're the only attorney on the panel. I share that dubious distinction with you, although I appreciate having that distinction. Anything you'd like to add?
I think it's just important to remember two things. One is that two things. How about that? Closer. Two things. One is that it's natural for regulated companies to push back against regulations that are newly being required of them. The record of industry complaining about the next regulation ready to destroy it is not a good one, including, I must say, in the coal industry particularly. But this is true going back to the New Deal and bankers, chemical companies, restaurant and hotels, worried about clean air rules related to tobacco. I detail some of this in my testimony. That's one thing. And the other thing is the stories are compelling. As Dr. Bivens suggested, individual firms may actually be impacted. But there are individuals who are benefiting as well, and we're not hearing from them today. The person who's protected from silica dust exposure and resulting cancer, that's a real live life saved as a result of the rule that's being talked about here. And there's going to be hundreds of lives saved every year by the silica rule that we're discussing. You go down the list of the regulations we're talking about, they have these net benefits. We aggregate them. But those net benefits are really an expression of the lives that are saved, the lives that are improved, the quality of life that is guaranteed as a result of the rules that are under discussion today.
All right, thank you. My time has expired, so thank you. Ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the Coalition of Environmental Groups in support of this, the stream rule, and also a letter from the American Sustainable Business Council that is regarding this hearing.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you. Okay. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is amazing that, I will say this, though, and we're going to get to Mr. Murray Miskow. I thank y'all for being a part of this panel. You actually work in industries and not discuss other industries, and I always think that the greatest thing about these panels, no offense to my legal experts and my think tanks, you're actually hiring people, giving people jobs, doing those kind of things that actually are being affected up here in Washington, and being a part of this panel makes great sense. The thing that just, and I've sat up here for just a few moments, and again, Mr. Bivens, probably the most, and I'm not saying dishonest or truthful, but the truthful thing you said just a moment ago was the shuffling of jobs. That one may have a problem and where it does. You know where that greatest impact is shown? Is in Washington, D.C. We have been wonderful at creating jobs in Washington, D.C. We've been wonderful at creating regulatory impact jobs in Washington, D.C. We have not been very good. I mean, when you have, I'm going to just name some things here because, Mr. Chairman, I couldn't think of a better time. I've got banks that are being regulated by more regulators than the bank has employees, and the regulators get mad because they don't have someplace to sit down. Mr. Weissman, you just said the silica rule. I was in environmental monitoring before. You know what one of the problems with the silica rule is? They can't get honest measurements. They can't determine actual levels. You go to the granite industry in my district, and you actually go into one of these facilities where they're already using protective devices and try and measure ambient silicate. I mean, it sounds great. You are going to save so many other people. It sounds wonderful, but yet the practicality is almost impossible to read. You get into phosphate readings in Lake Lanier in northeast Georgia, in which the phosphate levels taken from the sample are too small to be accurately counted, but yet the cities and counties are required to meet a level in which the federal government can't even verify. We talk about issues when it comes to the position of saying regulations help. There's nobody in this room and this is where the straw man arguments often come out in this, that Republicans don't like regulations, we want unsafe air, we want to drink dirty water, we want to do this. That's ridiculous. What is unfair to the American people is to come up with rules and regulations and say, well, they don't affect people. I've got an industry in my district, Ring, which is a nonprofit. They're wanting to expand and wanting to do, but they got caught with a 50 full-time equivalent issue. Now, we can say that, that regulations don't affect jobs, but they can't afford to grow because of these regulations that have been put on them. I have every night that I'm thankfully home, I get to sleep with and have a great relationship with a wife who is a teacher. I am tired of hearing my wife for 26 years. Because one of the things that we talk about in jobs in this committee and regulatory in this committee is we need an educated workforce. But yet we have an ever-expanding Department of Education up here, of many of which have never been in a classroom. Banking regulators who've never made a loan, telling the rest of the world how to make a loan. That is just ludicrous. Educators sitting in a cubicle saying, here's how you teach kids, and have never taught in a classroom. It's not the fact if regulation matters. It's the fact of Washington on steroids thinking we know better than everywhere else. If you want to help industry, if you want to help manufacturers I have yet to walk into a factory in which the general manager says, Doug, watch today, we're going to maim 3 people. Doug, I want you to watch this. We're hiding the ball, and we want to see people's fingers cut off today. It's fabulous. Watch it. When you have OSHA, which lives off its own fine system, hiring regulators, increasing the fine schedule, and going in, and this is what they do. They fine first instead of showing businesses, here's a better way, here's how you can fix the problem. Never seen that in your industries, I bet. But instead, it is because they have to keep their job. They're better than used car salesmen. OSHA inspectors have to write up and have to get fines, and then they settle the fines. If that is the regulatory environment that this country wants, then we're headed straight for disaster. So to say silicate's going to save all these lives, Mr. Weissman, show me how you're going to measure that in the ambient air. Show me how that's actually going to save people. I believe several things. I believe you eat right, you exercise daily, you follow your doctor's instructions, you die anyway. There are some things in life that are just attributable to living. And to say we're going to save so many people by something that you honestly can't measure is a disingenuous remark to a country that is struggling for jobs and education. Mr. Bivens, you said it right. Regulations help some areas and they hurt others. My problem is they hurt these people on this end who are actually trying to give people jobs, and they help people up here who've never done the jobs. I don't have any questions, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Congressman Jeffries.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for your presence here today. And if I could just start with Mr. Meyer, and perhaps we can take a macroeconomic approach to the economic situation that we find ourselves in today. Is it your view that regulations that have been put forth under this administration have stifled economic growth in America?
I would say that there's specific examples of regulation that have made it harder for young people to start businesses, but I would say this is by no means a phenomenon that's unique to this administration. If you look back at the history of regulatory growth and accumulation, it has been, unfortunately, a bipartisan priority to continue increasing the size and scope of federal regulation.
Now, we're in a period of unprecedented economic growth, correct?
I would not call it unprecedented. I would agree that we have seen a impressive streak of monthly job growth, but we still have not reached levels that would be expected this long after a recession.
71 consecutive months of private sector job creation is impressive, correct?
It is impressive that it's been unbroken, but if you look at the employment levels, especially taking into account decreased labor force participation, I think there are still a lot of problems going on in the labor force right now.
Right, 14 million jobs created under this administration is impressive, correct?
Yes, but if you look at for young people, the labor force participation rate for teenagers now is at the lowest rate ever. Same with for young adults, 20 to 24, and this isn't accounted for by increased education or increased people who are going to school. So
Over the last 7 years, the unemployment rate has gone from over 10% to under 5%, correct?
Could you say that one more time? Sorry.
I said over the last 7 years, the unemployment rate has gone from over 10% to under 5%. Is that
Well,
correct?
overall, but if we're looking at unemployment rates for young people, it's now still over 16% for teenagers, and it's pushing 9% for young adults.
Teenagers who will otherwise be in high school or college?
These are ones who want a job and are looking for a job but are unable to find one.
I certainly think it's the case that we need to do more. I just want to make sure that the record is clear as it relates to the progress that has already been made over the last 7 years. Now, you testified, I believe, that the length of the U.S. Code of Federal Regulation is preventing millennial entrepreneurship, because I want to get the quote right, attempting to comprehend with which of these million-plus restrictions applied to their businesses is a waste of young entrepreneurs' valuable time. Is that right?
Yes, that was in my testimony.
Now, there are a whole host of other factors that limit the ability of millennials to pursue entrepreneurial activities, correct?
Yes, there are many. Among them, having trouble finding a job, student loan debt. There are a lot of other factors.
Now, let's focus in on what I think is the predominant problem that we've got in America. Student loan debt is now $1.3 trillion, correct?
That is correct.
That's an unprecedented number in American history, correct?
Yes.
And that level of student loan debt, which is strangling young people, limits their ability to purchase a home earlier than or along the same time frame as prior generations, true?
Yes, when 70% of graduates are graduating with an average of $30,000 in student loans, that does put a burden on your future.
And it may even limit their ability to get married, start a family, consistent with the time frame of prior generations, correct?
I think that's one of the factors that has led to delayed marriages.
And wouldn't you also agree that that $1.3 trillion number is probably the predominant factor in limiting millennials from taking an entrepreneurial risk because of the need to consistently pay off student loan debt on a month-by-month basis?
Since the summer, since my book came out, I've traveled across the country and spoken to hundreds of millennials, a lot of them that want to be entrepreneurs, and student loan debt was brought up. But also a lot of people, when they wanted to start their business, they thought it was as simple as have an idea, comply with a few basic tax and regulatory requirements, and then start earning money or start providing opportunity to others. And they
I appreciate that. I've got limited time, so
sorry.
if I can just get one or two questions in, but I do really appreciate your thoughtful responses. Now, Facebook is a successful company, true?
Yes.
And that was started by millennials, correct?
Yes.
Twitter is a successful company, correct?
Correct.
Started by millennials, true?
Yes. Well,
Snapchat is a successful company?
yes. And that
Started by millennials, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Uber is a pretty successful company, true?
Yes.
Started by millennials, correct?
Just over the millennial cutoff.
Okay.
But
Yelp is a successful company, correct?
Is which company?
Yelp.
Yes.
Started by millennials?
I am not sure if Yelp's founder was a millennial or not.
Okay. No further questions. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Radcliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think everyone here knows and hopefully agrees that unnecessary regulations hurt job growth and suppress wages, but we often talk about that conceptually. We talk about it in broad strokes. We talk about tens of thousands of jobs that will be crushed by a new regulation created by some unelected bureaucrat, or the millions of dollars in compliance costs. But those tens of thousands of jobs aren't just numbers. They're individuals and their families. They're hardworking Texans, like a lot of the folks that I represent. And those millions of dollars in compliance costs don't just appear out of thin air. Those are funds that could otherwise be used to pay salaries or to create more jobs or to invest in future growth. Just 2 months ago, Gallup released a poll that found that 69% of Americans name big government as the biggest threat to our country right now and in the future. Not ISIS, not out-of-control spending, not a broken healthcare system, not a nuclear Iran. Now, those threats are certainly all real, but right now, 7 out of 10 Americans are most worried about a rapidly growing government, a government that does stifle opportunity instead of fostering it. And it's a real problem, as we're hearing today. It's forcing companies out of business that have been around for almost a century. Real people are losing their jobs. Businesses aren't growing. So, Dr. McLaughlin, I want to start with you. Regulators don't seem to understand that the world is interconnected. They appear to view each regulation in isolation and don't seem to understand that they are actually crushing the jobs of their fellow Americans. I want to give you an opportunity to elaborate on this very narrow-minded, naive, in my opinion, view of the world.
Thank you. Yes, typically a regulatory impact analysis performed by a regulatory agency looks at a single proposed rule in isolation. And that's not a bad thing, but it's also necessary to consider that rule as part of a system of rules. And to paraphrase actually Ranking Member Johnson, there are nuanced questions concerning the interplay of various forces here, and those should be considered. Complexity of the regulatory system can in itself be a negative force in our economy.
So I think you would agree with me that the claimed societal benefits of regulations are often inflated. And if you do agree with me, who is it that's pushing the inflated benefit estimates, and why are they doing that?
A couple of thoughts on this. First, the benefits estimates that are typically referred to are coming out of agencies' estimates before they make regulations. They aren't estimates after the fact. It'd be wonderful if we could implement a system of measuring both costs and benefits after rules have had their effects and we understand whether they're actually working or not. That'd be a good way, if there is inflating going on, to avoid that. But second, I also think it's relevant to consider the incentives of anyone who's engaged in a measurement activity, whether it's agencies or someone else. If agencies have incentives to make their numbers appear one way or the other, then perhaps you want to have independent analysis or another analyst take a look as well to corroborate.
Thank you, Doctor. Ms. Cabot, your testimony touched on two very troubling trends that we're seeing. One, out-of-touch regulators who seem to have no grasp of the real-world impact of their regulations. You said they need to understand the local impacts of their rule on real people whose real lives may be ruined by losing their job. I couldn't agree more. You also discussed a troubling pattern by this administration of imposing an illegal regulation, forcing industry to spend sometimes millions of dollars to comply with it, only to then have courts throw that regulation out. And by that time, of course, it's too late for the companies who've spent all that money to do anything about it and to comply. So as an individual, a business owner, and an employer, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the human element and consequence of those two trends.
My family has owned this company for 100 years, and a few years ago we had to make a decision with our next generation of owners if we wanted to continue to make brick or if we wanted to try and cash out. It was becoming more expensive to be a manufacturer. The markets were smaller. And one of the things that we really talked about was the role of regulation. How much were we going to have to spend in the future, and would it be worth it? It is expensive to make brick. Everything about it is expensive, frankly. However, when we talked about it with we got the entire family together, and we all wanted to invest in continuing to make brick. And it wasn't just us, because the people that we work with, we've worked with their families for a long time, and we feel responsible for the 80 people that work at our plant. It's not very many people, but there are people, and we want them to continue to have jobs.
My time's expired. I know, I say this in closing, that your company has been in your community for almost a century. That's quite a feat. Congratulations. It'd also be quite a shame if the reason it stopped doing business was, after nearly a century, was because of unnecessary regulatory interference. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I will now recognize myself for several questions, and I apologize for being late, but I had a piece of legislation on the floor that I had to be present for. I want to thank you all for being here. I know everyone is genuinely concerned about the issues presented to them, and even my colleagues, witnesses, I know that you're as genuine and concerned about these issues as we are. We just have a different aspect of how to get there. But I'll get to you two gentlemen in a moment. I want to ask Mr. Mr. Murray. And Mr. Weissman referred to something in his testimony that, quote, a history of regulated industries, Chicken Little claims about the devastating impact of proposed rules. Would you share with me some of the conversations you've had with people that, in your company about what they've expressed to you about losing their jobs or the potential of losing their jobs, what it's going to mean to them and to their families?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your question. It's devastating. I've talked to many of our employees. We have 2,000 that are laid off right now. I've had to lay off many of them myself. They express outrage. Financially, they have nowhere to go, and there's no job for them to go to. Our coal miners are making around $80,000 to $100,000 a year. Those jobs are irreplaceable anywhere in their community. Some of the greatest reward in my career has been when I've hired someone that literally was working at a fast food restaurant, and we gave him a job opportunity. He improved his standard of living, bought his first house, had his first child, grew up, sent his kids to college. We get to see those things on a daily basis. And with this stream protection rule, that won't continue to exist.
Thank you. Ms. Kebeth, you say compliance with OSHA's silica rule threatens the entire industry. Can you share with us how many silicosis cases have you had in the last 40 to 50 years with your company?
None at Whitaker Greer, which is what I know. None.
I'd like to read something into the record. In January of 2016, the Bureau of Labor Statistics seasonally adjusted U-3 unemployment rate fell to an 8-year low of 4.9%. But this figure masks workers who are underemployed or who have left the workforce. And those categories are included. The picture is much more troubling. The Bureau of Labor Statistics U6 employment number, which includes those who could not find full-time work, and those about 1 million, stands at 9.9%, almost 10%, more than twice the U-3 rate. So I see that all the time in my district. People who had good-paying jobs are now rated as being full-time employed because they're cutting grass or working part-time at a fast food stand. Gentlemen, there's no one that's more concerned about the environment as I do. I live out in the country. I get my water from the ground. I have children, and I want to protect them with my life. But we're getting to a point where, well, just let me read you something that actually an international, I don't have the quote, I will find it and get it in the record, but an international organization stated that they were talking about China, Pakistan, and India. They're the single, China, but in addition to the other two countries named, are the single largest sources of pollution in the world, not only with coal, but also with what they're burning and what they're dumping into their waters. And it goes on to refer to that if Canada and the United States stop using all fossil fuels whatsoever, it would be negligible, if anything, that would have any impact on cleaning up the environment. So I do believe that humans do create pollution problems, but I don't agree with the extent that is, I think, being propagated out there. I'm not sure which one of you, but you stated that jobs, in your opening statement, stated that jobs are created when jobs are lost. I invite you to come to my district, the 10th Congressional District of Pennsylvania, and I can assure you there's an electric plant that generated electricity using coal. It's out of business. I can assure you those people aren't coming to Washington to get a job. So, the benefits that you're stating, I think, Dr. Bivens, you stated quite a bit, the benefits of this, they're overstated as well as the other side of the coin here. So even looking at the banking industry, I hear it from the banking industry, I hear it from not only the coal industry, manufacturing, the food industry, OSHA, EPA, the Labor Bureau, the regulations are just crushing jobs in my district. I had a banker just tell me when I was in my district last week, for, if I have the figures right, 17 days, 12 regulators were in their bank. So they had to pay so much attention to those people. They weren't giving their customers the service that they really deserved. They weren't working on loans, and they left and everything was fine. So I think the pendulum is swinging in the wrong direction, and even though my time is expired as the chairman, I have a little bit of clout here, and I'll certainly give my colleague, if he wants to ask other questions. But what do you suggest? I mean, you're both very well-educated men, but have you ever, and please don't take this personally, have you ever visited a coal mine? Have you ever visited an electric generating power plant? Have you ever visited a construction site where a guy builds 3 houses a year and trying to make a living, but he can't now because now he has to build a reservoir at the tune of $20,000 within a 3-house project to take care of so-called runoff water? Help us out here. Mr. Weissman.
Well, a few things, Mr. Chair. First, on the environmental point you made, there are some global environmental issues, like climate change. In that case, it is not true that if the U.S. were to go to zero emissions, it would have no impact on the global problem.
I didn't say no impact. I'd have negligible impact.
It would not be negligible. It would have a significant impact, and would also have a demonstration impact that would change other things.
Yeah, but do you think we should be demonstrating to the world, to China, who keeps pumping out the burning coal at the risk of us losing jobs?
Because I will answer. I don't want to try to dodge the question. But I did not want to ignore the other pieces of what you were saying. No, I mean, obviously the U.S. is not going to go is not on track to go to zero emissions. If you actually look at the Clean Power Plan, though, as I discuss which is the actual plan on the table, as I discussed in my testimony, that will lower electric bills for consumers. So it's going to be both a net savings on cost-benefit analysis, but for just on the consumer side, in terms of what we spend on electric bills, we will save money as a result of the Clean Power Plan.
In the long run, but what do you say to the electric plant that put scrubbers in that they were supposed to put in 5 years ago and then gets another order from EPA saying now you've got to put this on top of the scrubbers, which costs millions and millions of dollars, and 172 people are put out of work? I mean, there has to be a cost analysis in here taking in consideration the jobs. And as far as expanding jobs in D.C., believe me, you don't want to go there with me.
Well, I will go. I mean, I'm happy to go there with you because I agree with you. There are too many jobs that and to the earlier member's point about distrust of big government, the story is about regulated industry having too much power, not being subjected to an overreach Washington. That's what people are objecting to, that big corporations have too much influence, that they're the ones who are writing the rules, that they have too many lobbyists here. Unfortunately, Public Citizen, our friends, we're not really a match in terms of numbers. That's not really the problem. So I agree that there is a broad perception of that. I think the assessment of what that means is off. I don't think actually people are saying they want the government to stand aside. They just want the government to stand with them. I take very seriously job loss. Mr. Ice has gone. I'm from Cleveland as well. So, and I come from an auto family. I come from a family that works with injured workers, know these issues quite well. No one from Cleveland is insensitive to the issue of job loss. And but if we think about the regulatory issue and job loss, there is no question that the most significant impact was the regulatory failure that led to the Great Recession. And if we want to sort of talk about what's the connection between regulation and jobs, that we did not prevent the financial sector from causing the Great Recession, by far the biggest story of the last 70 years on job loss.
Okay, I don't dispute you with that. In fact, I agree with you. But from a regulatory perspective of banks and lending, sure, that's important. We need a certain degree of regulation. But I was more so pointing to examples of manufacturing jobs in my district, which is a rural district, and a farming district. And I think you're aware of what the EPA tried to do in the farming industry with the Army Corps of Engineers, simply saying because there's a puddle of water on a farmland, this gives them the right through the Navigable Waters Act to come in and regulate. Listen, I live in the middle of 5 farms. I haven't seen a boat come through there yet. So, but I think we want the same thing. It's just a different approach. Dr. Bivens, do you want to respond to any of this?
If I could really quickly, I mean, a couple people have said it now, that the claim that the jobs created by regulatory changes are in D.C., there's no evidence that they show up in D.C. In fact, if you look over the past recovery, it's the public sector that has been really weak in job creation, historically weak in job creation, while the private sector's done very well. So you take the environmental regulations we've talked about, the jobs created through regulatory changes there are construction workers retrofitting buildings and weatherizing them. It's people who manufacture and install renewable capacity. It's the people bringing forward natural gas capacity sooner than it would otherwise. It's not jobs in D.C.
And I agree.
Entirely outside.
I agree with you, particularly in the natural gas aspect. One of the most clean burning fossil fuels that we have. I mean, we should be building an infrastructure on that. But again, you're comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing sitting behind a desk doing something where most people in the United States don't sit behind a desk. You know, they're farmers. They work in factories. They have to go to part-time jobs because we don't have the industry in this country because, in part, because of the environmental controls and OSHA and other issues. So we could debate this. I'd love to talk to you more so in the future about this, but given the fact that we're running close to 5 o'clock, we're going to shut down now the question and answer part of this, and I appreciate everything that all of you have brought to our attention, because these are clearly hearings that we want to get the facts, we want to get issues out, and that will help us make determinations on how we legislate or should be legislating in this country. So with that, this concludes today's hearing. I want to thank all you witnesses once again for coming here, spending time with us, traveling here, and I want you to have a safe trip back to wherever you're going. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record, and this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.